Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations. Hands Taran smelled of glue from fish bones and cheap fabric. He sat on, crouching behind the counter, and pulled a piece of canvas onto the stretcher made willow twigs. The fourth snake in mourning. Fingers were on their own, the knot at the crossroads, the thread through edge fabric. Checking the tension. Done. He put the snake next to the others and wiped his on apron. Market Square Brenmiro was slowly. The vegetables had laid out their goods. The blacksmith, through 2 rows, struck with a hammer at some invisible behind the wall of smoke. The baker brought out the first tray, and the smell of bread reached to Taran faster than sound the world of the barker. A good day for sales. Wind is but steady. The children will run here after noon, when their mothers let them to the square. 4 snakes. If she sells all 4 for a dime for each, that will be for flour and a bundle of candles. If you're lucky, and someone from the wealthy artisans, then be able to bargain a penny and a half. Copper coins, for a large snake with a tail. Taran took out from the bag a clobel with red paint, and began paint on canvas, the biggest snake, something similar. A bird. It turned out crooked. It is an artist, and never pretended to be one. But the children loved the vivid and didn't notice crooked lines. He, 22 years old. He, children. The workshop is a corner in the Hour of a Widow essays where he rents a room for 3 pennies a drop a week. All his tools fits in a single bag. Knives, an awl, skins of twine, fish glue in a clay pot, scraps of fabric he buys from the tailor on the next street for a handful of the smallest coins. He cuts the willow rods himself by the river outside the city wall. For free, that was all. His whole world lay between the river and the market square. He didn't complain. There was no one to complain to, and no reason to. He had work. His hands were intact. A roof over his head. Many in Brenmore couldn't even say that. The war in the north was in its 3rd year. The kingdom of Adra was at war with Holmark over a strip of land along the Set River. Taran didn't understand what it was all about. A river is just a river. Land is just land. But the king saw something he didn't, or pretended to see it. The war hadn't reached Brenmore yet. The town lay deep within Adra's territory, far from the front lines. But refugees were arriving. New faces every week. Thin, dusty, with empty eyes. They told of burned villages and fields sown not with grain, but with bodies. Taran listened and said nothing. He couldn't do anything for them. He made kites for children. That was all he knew how to do. After noon, the wind picked up. The first to arrive was a girl of about 7, clutching a copper coin in her fist. She took her time choosing and pointed to the smallest kite. Taran gave it to her without haggling. Then 2 boys came. Brothers. The older one haggled like an adult and drove the price down to 3 copper coins for 2 snakes. Taran agreed. Not because the boy was persuasive, it was just that Taran was a poor haggler and knew it. By evening, all 4 snakes were gone. 4 copper coins. Half a coin less than he'd expected, but enough. He gathered his bag and headed home. The walk across the market square took as long as it takes to walk 200 steps. Brenmore is a small town. Everything is close by. Everything is familiar. Everything is the same day after day. At home, the widow Essa had warmed up some soup. Taran ate a bowl and sat down to work. He needed new snakes for tomorrow. He picked up a willow rod and began to bend it. The rod cracked. Too dry. Taran picked up another one. This one gave way. He bent it into an arc and tied it with twine. Then he took a second rod and crossed them. The frame was ready. He'd done this 1,000 times. His hands knew every movement. His mind was free. He thought about the wind. Today the wind was good, steady and strong. The kites flew high. The The boys ran around the square and shouted. The strings tightened. The fabric flapped. One of the kites rose so high that the string tightened until it rang. Taran saw it. He saw the boy plant his feet on the ground and lean back. The kite was pulling him. A small piece of fabric on sticks was pulling a living child. It didn't lift him, of course. A child is heavier. But it pulled, noticeably. Taran remembered it. Not because he had an idea. He just remembered. His hands kept working. A rod, twine, glue, fabric, a knife, a rod. He finished 2 kites before the candle had burned halfway down. He set them to dry against the wall. He lay down on the mattress. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. The morning began just like the one before, and the one before that, and every morning before that. Taran got up, stretched his hands, checked the kites. The glue had set. The fabric was stretched taut. Good work. He went to the market. But he stopped on the way. He stood by the tailor's house and looked at the fabric scraps in the trash can. Large scraps. The tailor had been sewing a cloak for someone and cut off the excess. The piece of fabric was 3 times larger than what Taran usually used for a kite. He took it. The tailor didn't object. Trash is trash. Taran arrived at the market and, instead of laying out his wares, sat down on the ground behind the counter and began to think. A large piece of fabric. What to do with it? 4 small snakes. Or 1 big one. He'd sell the small ones for a copper coin each. The big one could sell for 3, maybe 4. Rich kids love big toys. He decided to make a big snake. Not because he wanted to experiment. It was just that the math favored 1 big snake. He needed thicker rods. Willow ones wouldn't do. Taran went to the carpenter at the edge of the market and bought 2 straight ash slats for half a copper coin. He returned. He spread out the fabric. He tried the slats against it. The cross turned out to be almost as tall as he was. He stretched the fabric over it. He secured it with glue and thread. He tied on a rope. Not 1, but 3. 3 attachment points instead of 1. He didn't know why. He just felt that a single rope wouldn't hold. When he raised the kite above his head, passers-by stopped. The thing was enormous. Bigger than any kite anyone had ever seen in Brenmore. Children gathered immediately. Taran stepped out from behind the counter and carried the kite to an open spot by the fountain. The wind caught the fabric right away. The kite shot upward. Taran let go of the string, and it slid through his palms, burning his skin. He gripped it tighter. The kite rose, quickly, eagerly, as if it wanted to go up. The rope tightened. Taran felt a tug on his shoulders. Strong, very strong. This kite didn't pull like a child's toy. It pulled like a horse pulls a cart. Steady and powerful. Taran braced his feet against the stones of the square and held on. The snake hung suspended in the air. Taran looked up. The fabric flapped in the wind. The slats held. The knots didn't come undone. People stood around watching. Taran said nothing. He looked at the rope in his hands and thought a single, simple thought. If this snake pulls this hard, what would happen if I made it even stronger? Next day, Taran did go to the market. He sat in the yard that the widow's essays and laid out on the ground fabric. Yesterday's snake stood by the wall. Taran looked at him and thought. The snake was as his height stretched, so that Taran barely managed on his feet. He weighs about 160 pounds. So we need snake that pulls up with force less than weight. He did know the words for express that. He simply saw the proportion. A small snake pulls weakly. Yesterday pulled hard. If increase the area of the doubles, the pull will increase. Roughly speaking, 2 by I. It is not scientist. He does know write down formulas. But he 30 years has been with his hands, and knows how to behave materials. Wood bends, then breaks. Fabric stretches, then it tears. The rope holds until a certain limit, then it bursts. Each material has a limit. It must find a balance between the size of the snake and the strength of the structure. Terran stood and walked to the river. He needs long slats. Ash is expensive. A carpenter, it will all his copper coins. That means we need another way. At river grows bamboo, their native plant. It was brought by from the southern islands 2020 ago. Several stems took root in damp soil by the shore. Terran cut 4 long stems, each taller. Bamboo is light, durable to bending. Doesn't break, but bends. Better ash, better willow. It brought stems home and began work. The frame he made from 2 crossed stems, each of it in 2 twice height. The cross turned out huge. The widow Essa came out into the way and asked what he was doing. Terran replied that he big snake. She looked at structure and said that it had had his, and went back home. Terran continued working. For fabric, needed more than scraps tailor scraps. He went to the merchant fabric. The old man by named Vors was canvas to fishermen. Coarse, thick fabric. Not silk, not linen. Canvas. It holds the wind and doesn't break from the tension. Terran bought a piece 2 on 3 steps behind 7 copper coins. Almost all his money. I went home. He pulled a tarpaulin over frame made bamboo. I secured it. I took thicker eye, the one for children's kites, and that which is tied boats to the pier. I bought a spool from that same Vorsa from 2 pennies. That's it. Money are gone. If this snake doesn't work, Terran will go hungry. He checked every knot, every fastening. I ran my fingers over every joint of the bamboo. The frame is flexible. The fabric is stretched evenly. The twine is rolled up into neat coil. Done. To carry this to Market Square is impossible. The snake is large. Terran took the structure on shoulder and walked toward the city. To the between Brenmore and the river, an open area. The wind is stronger than in the city. The walls don't get in the way. He laid out the snake on the grass. He tied it to 3 points on the frame. Free end wrapped around the belt and threaded through his arms. If the snake pulls too hard, then width won't hold. Safety. Safety line. The wind blew steady and strong from the west. Terran raised the kite above his head and let go. The fabric flapped like a sail. The kite shot upward. The line tightened instantly. The jerk hit Terran in the waist, and he took 2 steps forward before bracing himself. The pull was monstrous. The kite rose and dragged him along. Terran dug his heels into the ground. His heels carved furrows in the soft grass. He held on. The kite hovered high above. The line hummed. Terran felt the vibration in his hands and lower back. He looked up. The kite was far away. High. Higher than any roof in Brenmore. Higher than the city guard tower. It looked small against the clouds. Terran stood there, holding the rope and thinking. This kite was pulling him with a force that almost tore his feet from the ground. Almost. Not quite. If he made it even bigger, if he increased the surface area of the fabric by another third. No. He stopped himself. Not the surface area of the fabric. It's not just about size. It's about the angle. He'd noticed something when he'd flown small kites for the children. If the string is short, the kite hangs almost vertically and pulls sideways. If the string is long, the kite goes far and pulls upward. The angle between the string and the ground changes the direction of the pull. He didn't need a kite that pulled sideways. He needed a kite that pulled upward. Straight up. Terran began experimenting right there in the field. He let out the string and watched the angle. Pulled it back in. Let it out again. At a certain length of the rope, the kite took up a position almost directly above him. The pull was upward. Taran felt his weight lessen. His feet were on the ground, but it felt lighter, as if someone had grabbed him by the waist and pulled him toward the sky. He stood there until his arms ached from the strain. Then he slowly pulled the snake back. He coiled up the rope. He slung the frame over his shoulder and headed home. S's widow met him at the door and asked where he'd been. Taran replied that he'd been out for a walk. She looked at the bamboo frame on his shoulder and the grooves from the heels of his boots and said nothing. Taran lay down and fell asleep instantly. His hands ached. His back ached. But his mind was still working even in his sleep. He woke up before dawn with a single thought. He didn't need to make one snake anymore. He needed to make 2 snakes. Tie them to a single point. 2 snakes pull twice as hard as one. And if each one pulls almost enough to lift a person, then 2 together will pull more than enough. It's easier than building one giant snake. Easier to find materials. Easier to control. Easier to replace if one breaks. Taran sat up on the mattress and stared into the darkness. He needed more canvas, more bamboo, more twine, and he had no money, not a penny. He'd spent it all on the first kite. So he needed to sell something. He looked around the room. Tools, a knife, an awl, glue. If he sold the tools, he wouldn't be able to make kites. If he couldn't make kites, he wouldn't be able to earn money. A vicious circle. Taran thought. Then he got up and went to the river. He cut some more bamboo. Bamboo is free. One problem solved. He returned to the tailor. There were no scraps. The tailor was sewing small orders, and the scraps were tiny. Taran went to Vors. He asked to borrow some canvas. Vors refused. Taran proposed a deal. He would advertise for Vors. He would fly a huge kite over the market with Vors' name painted on it. Everyone would see it. Everyone would talk about it. Vors looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he thought about it. Then he agreed. 2 pieces of canvas in exchange for advertising in the sky. Taran went home and started building a second kite, an exact copy of the first. A bamboo frame, canvas, twine, the same dimensions, the same knots, the same 3 attachment points. On the canvas of the first kite, he painted the words in red paint. Vors, fabric, sails. Crooked, but legible. The next morning, he dragged both kites out of town, to the same field. There was wind. Taran stuck a stake into the ground, a thick one, knee-deep. He tied both strings to it. Then he launched the first kite. It soared upward and pulled on the stake. The stake held. Taran launched the second one. Both kites hung in the sky side by side. The strings hummed. The stake bent, but didn't come out of the ground. Taran untied the strings from the stake and tied them into a single knot. He tied it to his belt. He stood up. The 2 snakes pulled him upward. He felt his heels lift off the ground. Not completely, but almost. He was standing on his toes. The snakes pulled. The wind hummed. Taran stood alone in the field, standing on tiptoe against his will. He was being lifted by a force whose name he did not know. He knew only that it existed, and that it obeyed the size of the fabric and the strength of the wind. He stood like that for a long time. Then the wind picked up, and Taran lifted off the ground. A hand's breadth, maybe 2. His legs hung in the air. He wasn't breathing. Then the wind died down, and he came back down. His feet touched the grass. His knees buckled. He sat down on the ground and looked up at the sky. The snakes hung above. Ropes ran upward from his waist in 2 taut lines. Taran sat in the grass and realized what had happened. He had just been flying. 1 second. 2. 3. His feet hadn't touched the ground. A man hung in the air. No one saw it. No one knew. Just him, the wind, and two pieces of canvas on bamboo frames. Taran gathered the kites and walked home. He wasn't thinking about anything. His hands were shaking, and he didn't know why. From exhaustion, or because the world had just changed. Taran didn't sleep all night. He lay on mattress and looked at ceiling, and his body remembered the sensation of emptiness under its feet. This lasted seconds, but the body remembered it. He stood before dawn and went out into the courtyard. The cold air brought my thoughts into order. Two snakes lifted it in palm from the ground, on 1 second. The wind was strong, but not hurricane force. A typical westerly wind. So 2 snake is almost enough. He needs a third one. Or we need to increase the existing ones. Or need something third option. Taran sat on log by the wall and began to go through options. 3 snakes, 3 strings, 3 dots of tension. It's hard to control. If the wind changes, then 1 snake will to the side, and 2 will stay in there, and all 3 get mixed up. He saw how the children tangle the ropes of little snakes. With 3 bigger, it worse. No, 3 separate snake is a bad idea. You need 1. But not 1 big one. 1. Another kind. Taran closed his and imagined himself what he and field. 2 snakes hang side by side. They're upward. Between them is a void. What if we move the void? What if we them? Not 2 frames, but 1 shared one. 1 snake with an area 2 snakes, but with 1 frame. 1 mounting point. 1 cord. He opened his and walked after bamboo to the river. 4 hours he built. The frame turned out 4 steps in long and 3 by wide. He used 6 bamboo too. 2 long lengthwise, 2 across, 2 along diagonals for stiffness. The sailcloth he sewed from 2 pieces. The seams I coated with glue for strength. The result was structure measuring with a cart. It did fit in the widow essays. Taran built on field behind the city. Alone. In silence. He didn't want for anyone to see him. Not because he was shy. He just didn't know what to say if asked. He didn't even understand what he was doing himself. He was simply following the logic of the materials. More fabric, more tension, higher lift. When the frame was ready, he checked every joint, pulled on every strand, tugged at every seam. Tight. He tied the rope to 4 points on the frame. He gathered all 4 ropes into one and tied it to his belt. Secure. 3 loops, a double knot. If he lifted it, he had to be sure it wouldn't fall. The wind that day was moderate. Taran lifted the frame above his head. He couldn't hold the cart-sized structure by himself. It was light but bulky. He set it on its side and turned it into the wind. The sail flapped. The frame jerked out of his hands. He let go. The kite went up. Not as fast as the small ones. Heavier, but steady, confidently. The rope unwound, tightened. Taran felt a tug on his belt, and he was pulled. Upward. Not a hand's breadth. Not 2. His feet left the ground by a full step. He hung in the air. The belt dug into his ribs. His hands gripped the rope. The ground was below. Grass. A path. The stake he'd driven in yesterday. He saw everything from above, from a height of 1 man's height, then 2. The wind didn't let up. The kite rose higher and pulled him along. Taran couldn't control the ascent. He just hung there. 3 heights above the ground. 4. 5. He saw the roofs of Brenmer. He saw the river beyond the field. He saw the road leading north. Fear didn't come right away. First came surprise. The world looked different from above, not like from a hill. From a hill, you stand on the ground and look into the distance. Here, the ground was below, under his feet, all at once. He saw the shape of the fields, not strips but rectangles. He saw the bends of the river, not a line but a snake. He saw all of Brenmore. The town was small, ridiculous, a cluster of houses on the bank. He would never have thought Brenmore was so small. From the inside it seemed like a whole world. From above it was a speck. Then fear set in. Taryn looked down. The ground was far away. If the rope snapped, if the knot came undone, if the belt gave way, he would die. Just like that. So quickly. He was hanging from a piece of rope tied to a piece of cloth stretched over sticks, and between him and death were only the knots he had tied with his own hands. His hands were sweaty. His fingers slipped on the rope. Taryn gripped it tighter. Breathing became difficult. The belt pressed against his ribs. He was swaying. Not much, but enough to make his stomach rise to his throat. Taryn began to pull on the rope. If he pulled the snake closer to him, it would descend lower. The logic was simple. He pulled, hand over hand, slowly. The snake descended. The ground drew nearer. First, the rooftops of houses came into view, then the trees. Then he saw individual stones on the path. His feet touched the grass. His knees buckled. He fell to all fours and stayed that way until his breathing evened out. The kite was still pulling. The string stretched into the sky. Taryn drove a stake into the ground and tied the rope to it. He stood up. His legs were shaking. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. But he stood there and looked up at his kite and knew two things at once. First, it works. A person can rise into the air on a kite. Second, it will kill him if he doesn't figure out how to control the descent. The harness is a bad solution. It's pressing against his ribs. His arms get tired. If the wind suddenly dies down, he'll plummet to the ground, and the belt won't help. He needs something else. Not a belt. A seat. Something to sit on, with back support, so his arms are free, so he can pull and release the line without fear of letting go. Taryn untied the kite from the stake and pulled it down to the ground. He folded the frame. He rolled up the sail. He went home. His hands were shaking the whole way. S's widow opened the door and saw his face. She asked what was wrong with him. Taryn replied that everything was fine. She said he was as white as flour and that he'd better sit down. He sat down. He drank some water, sat for a while. Then he went to his corner and began building a harness. A board for sitting, rope fastenings on the sides, loops for his feet so he wouldn't slip, 2 free hands to control the rope. He worked late into the night. The candle burned out. He lit a second one. Candles cost money. No money. He'll think about that tomorrow. Today, he's building the harness. By morning, the harness was ready. Rough. Simple. A board on ropes with loops for his feet and 2 attachment points to the main rope. Not comfortable, but functional. Taryn looked at it and realized he needed to test it today, right now, while there's still wind. He took the kite and the harness and went out to the field. The sun had just risen. No one around. The field was empty. He laid out the kite, tied the harness to the line, sat down on the board, raised the kite. The wind caught it. It lifted him up. The board hung level. His feet were pressed against the loops. His hands were free. The rope ran upward from the attachment in front of him. He could pull it and let it go. He could control the height. Taryn rose, slowly, in control. He let the rope out a step, rose higher. Another step, higher still. He stopped at a height of 10 stories, maybe 12. The ground below, Brenmore in the distance, the river glistening in the sun. Terran sat in the air on a wooden plank tied to a piece of cloth and looked down at the world from above. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid, because his hands were free, and he knew how to get down. 3 days Terran flew over the field behind Brenmore. Every morning until dawn, he went out as a snake on his and a pendant in hands. I launched it. I rose. I sat in the air. I learned. The first day he mastered the height. Let go the rope and climb up. Pull and lower yourself. Simple. But there is a limit. The higher, the weaker the book at the top differs from the wind at the bottom. The snake begins to slither. It moves to the side. The rope sags. Terran discovered that there is a height at which the snake behaves it consistently, and above which he may to fluctuate. He remembered this height. The second day he mastered the wind. The wind did not permanent. It changes the book and direction every few minutes, sometimes every few seconds. A gust, a lull, a gust, calm. The snake reacts to every change. A surge pulls up and to the side. The lull drops down. If you hold the line tension, then during calm, snakes coils and falls. Terran has learned to feel the wind through the rope. The tension is increasing. A gust. Hands let go. The snake gains height. The tension drops. A lull. Hands pull up. The snake descends but doesn't fall. Rhythm. Like breathing. Inhale, exhale. Let go, pull in. On the third day, he learned to look. Height changes everything. From the ground, the forest is a wall of trees. From above, the forest is a speck. From the ground, the road curves around a bend and disappears. From above, the road is visible in its entirety, from Brenmore to the horizon. Terran saw things he didn't know about. He didn't know that behind the grove east of the town there was a lake. Small, round, hidden by trees. You can't see it from the ground. From above, it glistened like a coin. He didn't know that the road north splits behind the hill. One branch goes straight, the other heads east. Only one road is visible from the ground. The other is hidden by a bend in the terrain. He didn't know that the Set River loops south of Brenmore. On the map he'd seen at the merchant's, the river ran straight. In reality, it bends. The map lied. Or rather, it wasn't lying. It was simply drawn from the ground, by someone who walked along the river and recorded the direction. But the river's direction from the shore is deceptive. You're walking east, and the river is right there. You think the river is flowing east, but it curves so smoothly that you don't notice. From above, the curve is instantly visible. Terran realized one important thing. All the maps in this world are wrong. Every single one. Because they're all drawn from the ground. No one has ever seen the earth from above. No one knows the true shape of the rivers and roads and fields and forests. Only he does. This realization came quietly, not like a blow, like dawn, slowly and unstoppably. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Terran rose as usual. The wind was good. The kite held steady. He sat high and looked down the northern road. And he saw dust, far away, on the road beyond the hill. A lot of dust. Not a single rider. Not a wagon. Many feet kick up that much dust. A column. Terran watched the dust. It was moving toward Brenmore, slowly, steadily, like a river flowing to the sea. An hour later, he saw the glint of metal in the dust. The sun was reflecting off something. Armor, spearheads, shields. An army was marching along the northern road toward Brenmore. Terran was no soldier. He didn't know whose army it was, Adra's or Hallmark's. He didn't know the shape of the shields or the color of the banners. He saw only dust and metal and a column stretching over the hill and disappearing beyond his sight. Many people. So many. He descended, quickly, pulled the rope hand over hand, landed. His legs buckled from the speed, but he steadied himself. He tied the kite to a stake. He ran into the city. He ran across the field toward the city gates. The guards at the gates looked at him in surprise. Taran ran up and said that an army was coming from the north. The guard asked how he knew. Taran opened his mouth and closed it. What to say? I saw it from above. I was flying. The guard repeated the question. Taran said he'd seen dust from the hill. The guard looked north. The road was empty. The hill blocked the view. The army was still behind the hill. Nothing could be seen from the ground. The guard said Taran was drunk and told him to go home. Taran didn't leave. He stood by the gate and waited. 2 hours later, a cloud of dust appeared on the road beyond the hill. The guard saw it. A horn sounded. The gates began to close. People ran along the walls. Someone was shouting. The captain of the guard climbed the tower and looked north. He saw what Taran had seen 2 hours earlier. An army. Banners. They were the banners of Adra. His own army. Not enemies. Brenmore lay deep within the kingdom, and a foreign army could not have reached this far without passing through a dozen fortresses. Taran stood at the gate and watched as the column entered the city. Infantry. Cavalry. Supply wagons. The soldiers were tired and dusty. They were heading north, to the front. Brenmore was a staging area. The captain of the guard came down from the tower and approached Taran. He asked how Taran had known about the army 2 hours before it became visible from the tower. Taran paused. Then he told the truth. He said he had been in the air. The captain didn't understand. Taran explained. He takes to the air in a large kite. From there you can see far, further than from any tower. The captain looked at him silently. Then he asked if Taran could demonstrate. Taran nodded. They went out to the field together. The captain's name was Morden, an old soldier with a scar across his left eyebrow. He limped on his right leg, and that slowed them down. On the field, Taran untied the kite from the stake. He checked the string. He checked the suspension. He sat down. Captain Morden stood and watched. The wind caught the kite. Taran rose, smoothly, steadily, just as he had done 10 times before. Morden grew smaller below. His face turned upward, his mouth open. Taran rose to his usual height. He hovered. He looked around. He saw the army camp the soldiers were setting up in Brenmore Square. He saw the road to the north. Clear. No one else. He saw the river. A fisherman on the bank. A bird over the water. He descended. Morden was standing in the same spot. He hadn't moved since Taran had risen. His face was strange. Not fear. Not surprise. Something else. He looked at Taran the way a general looks at a new weapon. Appraisingly. Greedily. Silently. Morden spoke a single sentence. He said that Taran needed to speak with General Ketra. Taran asked who that was. Morden replied that Ketra commanded the army that had just entered Brenmore. Taran said he didn't want to talk to anyone. He wanted to go home and make kites. Morden looked at him and replied that it wasn't an offer. General Ketra was a short man with broad shoulders and a short beard. He sat at the table in city, and L. Not dinner, no lunch, just food. Bread, salted meat, a mug of diluted wine. He ate like a man who is used to when there is a chance and not when I'm hungry. Morden led Taran to him through an hour after the flight. Taran stood in front of the general's table and felt like small, not because of Ketra. Ketra was shorter than him in height. But in the room there are 4 officers in chainmail, swords at their belts. Faces are stern. They stared at Taran as an insect that has flown into the tent. Morden briefly explained what he had seen. The better of serpents. He climbed into the air. He sees further than from the tower. He saw the army behind 2 hours before the guards. Ketra stopped chewing. He put down the bread on the table, wiped my hands on my pants. He looked at Terran. His eyes were gray, calm, not angry and not kind. A person's of a person who makes decisions based on which life lives, and which is used to this. Ketra asked how high it goes. Terran replied that doesn't know for sure, above the tallest tower in Brenmore, maybe in 10 times higher. Ketra asked how. Far he. Terran said that he sees the road to north to the horizon. He sees the river set to south. He sees a grove to the east and a lake beyond it that isn't on any map. Ketra turned to one of the officers. The officer took out a map and spread it out on the table. Ketra asked Terran where the lake was. Terran looked at the map and pointed. The officer shook his head. The map shows a forest in that spot, and nothing else. Ketra looked at the officer, then at Terran. Then he said he wanted to see the flight for himself. They left the administration building. The entire staff, Ketra, 4 officers, Morden, Terran in front. He was carrying the snake on his shoulder, the pendant in his hand. People on the streets of Brenmore parted before the officers. Soldiers saluted. Terran walked beside the general and felt as if he were being led to an interrogation. They went outside the city. In the field, Terran unfurled the kite. He checked the knots. The general and his officers stood in a line and watched. Terran sat on the suspension line. He lifted the kite. The wind caught the sail, and the kite soared upward. Terran was pulled upward. The ground receded beneath his feet. He was rising. The general grew small. The officer stood as if turned to stone. Morden, the only one who had seen this before, stood slightly ahead of the others, his head tilted back as he watched Terran. Terran rose to his usual altitude. He stabilized the kite. He sat there for a moment. Then he began to look around. From this height, he could see Ketra's army camp. Tents, wagons, horses grazing outside the city, campfires. He saw how far the supply column stretched along the northern road. He saw 2 horsemen galloping south. He saw a herd of cows grazing 2 miles to the west. He saw everything. He stayed in the air as long as he could. The wind was dying down. The glider began to drift. Terran pulled on the rope and descended. The landing was soft. He had learned to slow down by pulling the rope in short jerks. He touched the ground. He stood up. General Ketra stood before him, silent. His officers were silent. The silence lasted a long time. Then Ketra turned to Morden and asked if anyone else knew. Morden replied that only the guards at the gate knew about Terran's warning, but hadn't seen the flight. Ketra nodded. Then he looked at Terran and said that from this moment on, Terran was assigned to the army. Terran didn't understand right away. He asked again. Ketra repeated himself. Terran was now part of the army. He would take to the air before every battle and report on the enemy's position. He would be given a salary, food, protection, guards for his snake. Terran said he didn't want to. He wasn't a soldier. He was a craftsman. He made toys for children. Ketra looked at him blankly and said that war didn't ask what anyone wanted. Terran looked at the 4 officers with swords. He looked at Morden, who had turned away. He looked at the general, who was no longer looking at him, but was talking to one of the officers about tomorrow's route. Terran stood in the field with a snake at his feet and realized that his life had just ended. Not life in general, but that life. Quiet. Small. The market square. Copper coins. S's widow. Fabric scraps at the tailor's. Bamboo by the river. All of that was left behind. He hadn't chosen. The army had come to his city and seen what he could do, and now he belonged to the army. Just as a sword belongs to a warrior, just as a horse belongs to a rider. A tool, not a person. Taran packed up the snake in silence. A soldier helped him carry the frame. Another soldier carried the suspension. A third wound up the rope. They handled his things carefully, as if they were weapons, because to them, they were weapons. Taran was put up in a tent next to headquarters, not with the soldiers, separately. They gave him a blanket, a bowl of porridge, a mug of water. He sat on the blanket, ate the porridge, and thought. 3 days ago, he was a craftsman. 2 days ago, he had risen above the rooftops for the first time. Yesterday, he had seen the army from the sky. Today, he himself belonged to the army. The speed at which his life had changed was beyond comprehension. He hadn't had time to be afraid. He hadn't had time to think it through. He didn't have time to decide. Everything was decided for him. General Ketra decided that a man who could see from the sky was more useful than 1,000 infantrymen. And he was right. Taran understood that. He wasn't offended. Resentment is pointless when dealing with power. A general is power. An army is power. Taran is sticks and rags. He finished his porridge. He lay down. He closed his eyes. Through the tent wall, he could hear the officers talking. They were discussing tomorrow's march, northward, to the front line. Hallmark had broken through the defenses at the crossing over the Set and advanced 3 leagues deep into Adra territory. Ketra was leading reinforcements. 7,000 infantry, 1,500 cavalry, 400 supply wagons, and 1 dragon master. Taran listened and couldn't sleep. That night, Morden came to him. The captain of the guard sat down at the entrance to the tent and said quietly that he regretted bringing him to the general. Taran replied that he didn't regret it. That would be pointless. Someone would have found out anyway. Morden paused and said that Taran would be better off being useful. Useful people are spared in war. Useless ones are not. Then he left. Taran lay in the darkness. In the morning, the army would march north. He would go with them. The dragon would ride in a wagon. The pendant would hang from his shoulder. He would rise into the air and look down at the earth from above and tell the general what he saw. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice. He remembered the boy in the market square who was pulling on a rope and the little snake was pulling him back. The boy was laughing. It was a game. It was. The army moved slowly. 7,000 infantrymen don't know walk fast. They can walk for a long time. Step, step, step. And by hour, dust rose from beneath thousands feet and hung above a column like a yellow cloud. Taran walked beside with the cart behind which lay his snake. Rama was for transportation. 6 bamboo are tied with rope. The sailcloth is folded. The pendant hung on side of the... The driver glanced at Taran with curiosity, but didn't spoke. The soldiers around were silent. They didn't know who he, no officer, not soldier, not doctor, not blacksmith. A strange man who walks beside with staff cart and carries on his shoulder a coil-thick rope. On second day of the Ketra called him. The general was on horseback at the head of the column. Taran approached. Ketra did dismounted. He looked at Taran from down from the saddle and said that tomorrow by evening they will, their hallmark's hallmark. Scouts report that the enemy has entrenched itself on the hills beyond the crossing across the Set. Ketra wants to know the exact location, quantity, direction of fortifications, where cavalry, where the infantry is, where reserves. Taran asked how he should understand. He a craftsman. He does distinguish cavalry from the baggage train at distance. Ketra nodded. He expected this question. Beside Taran will an officer. Lieutenant Vars. He will teach Terran what to look for. Vars turned out to be a young man with a narrow face and quick eyes. He served in reconnaissance for years. He knew what the army from above, more. Precisely didn't. Didn't because that no one had seen the army from above. But he knew how it was put together. Where the cavalry is. Where the infantry is. How are tents headquarters? What does the supply train? Where are the sentries? The rest of the day, Vars walked alongside with Terran and explained. The cavalry is a lot of horses in one place. Above, they will look like a cluster of dots separately from the main camp. Infantry is tents in rows. Headquarters is a large tent in the center or on a hill. Then is a line of wagons. Scouts are lonely figures in the first from the camp. Terran listened and memorized. Vars drew on the ground with a stick for during rest stops. Here the camp. Here the cavalry on the left. Here the infantry in center. Here the supply train behind. Here the patrols in a ring. Terran looked at the drawings and tried to imagine what it would look like from spots, lines, dots. He got used to seeing the earth from above, but he saw fields and rivers and roads, not army. Then is something else. The army is on the move. The army is hiding. The army is deceiving. Vars said one thing which Terran remembered. He said that most important is not that you see, but that what you don't see. If you see infantry, but do you see the cavalry, then cavalry is hidden. Where is it? Behind the forest, in ravine, behind the hill. If you see a camp, but do you see the guards, then camp is a trap. Empty tents, a sham, the real army in another place. Terran listened, and his confidence melted with every word. This just to rise and look. It's read, like a book. Just letters are unfamiliar, and the text written by an enemy who wants for you read incorrectly. On third day of the march, they approached the set. Ketra stopped the army at 2 legions from the crossing. The camp set up in a low-lying area behind the hill. On the whole mark, the hill is blocking the view. Ketra couldn't want for the enemy to know about the reinforcements. In the evening, the general convened his staff, 5 officers, Vars, Terran, a small tent, candles, a map on the table. Ketra pointed at the map and said that, according to intelligence reports, Hallmark's army, numbering about 5,000, was stationed on the hills beyond the crossing. They control the bridge, the only bridge across the set in this area. The river is deep. The only ford is 20 leagues to the east. Too far. We need a bridge. The enemy has the bridge. Ketra turned to Terran and said that by morning he wanted the full picture. Where they are stationed, how many, how fortified. Do they have reserves? Terran nodded. His throat was dry. He stepped out of the tent and stood in the darkness. Stars overhead. The campfires behind him. Ahead, somewhere beyond the hill, the enemy. 5,000 men who had come to kill. And in the morning, he would rise into the air right above them. Vars approached from behind. Terran hadn't heard his footsteps. Vars asked how Terran was feeling. Terran replied that he wanted to go back to Brenmore. Vars said that everyone here wanted to go back. He paused. Then he said there was one more thing he hadn't mentioned. Archers. Hallmark is famous for its archers. Longbows. A range of 300 paces. If Terran were to hang at a height of 300 paces, he would be within range. Terran looked at Vars. Vars was looking away. His face was calm, as if he'd just said it was going to rain tomorrow. Terran asked what height was safe. Vars said 500 paces for sure. 400 probably. 300. No. Terran did the math. His usual working height was about 250 paces, maybe 300. He'd never measured it exactly. So he'd be hanging right on the edge. An arrow might reach it, or not. It depends on the bow, on the wind, on luck. Taran went to the cart and began checking the kite. His hands did the familiar motions. Knots, fastenings, twine, canvas. He checked and double-checked. Not because anything was wrong, because his hands had to be busy. Otherwise, he'd start thinking about the arrows. The morning dawned gray and windy. A good wind, strong, from the west. Taran assembled the kite in the pre-dawn twilight. The soldiers around the camp moved silently. No trumpets, no shouts. Ketra didn't want any noise. Taran carried the glider out of the camp, toward the top of the hill. Not quite to the very top, a little lower, so it wouldn't be visible from the enemy's side. Vars walked beside him. 2 soldiers followed behind them. Guards. Taran laid the glider out on the grass. His hands didn't tremble. He was surprised by this. They should be trembling. He was afraid. But his hands knew their job and refused to be afraid. He sat on the harness, checked the leg loops, checked the rope, nodded to Vars, lifted the glider. The wind caught it. Taran was pulled upward. The hill remained below. Ketra's camp came into full view. Tents in neat rows. Carts, campfires, horses. 7,000 men packed into a rectangle at the bottom of the valley. Taran let out the rope and rose higher. The hill receded below, and he saw the other side. The set river glistened gray in the morning light. A bridge, wooden, wide enough for a cart, hills on the other bank, and on the hills, Hallmark's army. Taran froze. He was seeing an army for the first time in his life. Not a column on the march, an army in position, ready for battle. Tents on the summit of the central hill, many tents, stakes driven into the slopes, barricades. A palisade stood in front of the bridge on this side of the river. Helmets glinted behind the palisade. Sentries. Taran let out more rope and climbed higher, above the range of the arrows, hoping it was higher. Now he could see more. Behind the central hill, a second camp. Smaller, separate. Horses, lots of horses. Cavalry. Not stationed with the infantry, but separately. Behind the hill, hidden. You can't see it from the ground. You can't see it from the crossing. Only from above. Vars was right. The most important thing is what you can't see. Taran memorized it. Tents, stakes, palisade, cavalry behind the hill, the direction of the defensive lines. He tried to count the tents but lost track. There are too many of them. He looked at the left flank. The forest reached the river to the left of the bridge. A dense forest. Nothing is visible between the trees. But there were wagons at the edge of the forest. Supply wagons. Why is the supply train at the edge of the forest? Strange. The right flank. An open field. Nothing. Empty. Too empty. Vars said that emptiness was suspicious. The right flank was empty. That meant there could be an ambush there. Or not. Taran didn't know. He was a craftsman. He saw, but didn't understand. The wind picked up, and the glider swayed. Taran grabbed the rope. Time to land. He pulled the kite in with jerks. He descended behind the hill. He landed. Vars was waiting for him with a piece of charcoal and a flat board. Taran began to speak. Vars drew. A river. A bridge. A palisade. The central hill. Tents. Cavalry behind the hill. A forest to the left. Carts at the edge of the woods. An empty right flank. Vars drew quickly and asked questions. How many tents were with the cavalry? Terran didn't know exactly. A lot. Maybe 40. Maybe 60. Vars nodded and counted. 40 tents meant about 400 horsemen. 60 meant 600. A significant difference. They carried the board to Ketra. The general looked at the drawing, then at Terran, then back at the drawing. He was silent for a long time. Then he pointed at the cavalry behind the hill and said that without Terran, he would have sent the infantry across the bridge, and Hallmark's cavalry would have struck his flank. A classic trap. He would have lost a third of his army before he realized what had happened. Ketra looked at Terran, and for the first time, something resembling respect flashed in his gray eyes. Ketra did attack the bridge. Instead, that he sent the infantry along the river to east. Do not to ford, which was in 20 leagues. Closer, in 3 leagues above, up the Terran. Saw from the air where the river widened and shallow. Not ford, but shallow for infantry to pass, across waist in water. This place was not anywhere a single map. Maps were drawn from the ground, from the depth is, from above you, the bottom. The light bottom means shallow, dark is deep. Terran said about this to Ketra. The general sent scouts to check. They returned by half a day. Terran was right. A shallow spot. Rocky bottom. It is possible, cross. Ketra changed the plan of the battle. Instead of a head-on assault bridge, he 3,000 infantrymen across shallow water above, upstream. They crossed the river at night. Quiet, without torches, across waist in cold water. By dawn, 3,000 soldiers Adris stood on enemy shore, 3 leagues from the hallmark. The enemy didn't. In the morning, Terran got up again. Ketra ordered to watch the camp hallmark and report immediately if the enemy notices the transfer. Terran was hanging in the air and watched. The hallmark? Nothing was moving. The sentries stood at their posts. The cavalry behind the hill stood still. No one knew that 3,000 soldiers were already on their shore. Terran gave the signal, a red rag on a rope. It meant all clear. Vars down below saw the rag and ran toward Ketra. They had worked out a system of signals the night before. Red rag, all clear. White rag, the enemy is moving. 2 rags, danger. Primitive, but enough for a start. A voice at this altitude is useless. The wind carries the words away. Terran hung there and watched. The transferred troops were moving toward Hallmark's camp from the east, slowly, cautiously, through the forest. From above, Terran could see their movement, dark figures among the trees. The enemy didn't see him. Their sentries were looking west, at the bridge, where they expected the attack to come from. They weren't looking east because no one was coming from the east. Or so they thought. Terran watched both armies at the same time. His own, which was creeping through the forest. The enemy's, which was looking the wrong way. It was a strange feeling. He saw the future. Not literally, but he saw 2 streams moving toward each other, and one of them was unaware of the other. He knew what would happen before it happened. 3 hours later, Adra's infantry emerged from the forest and struck Hallmark's camp from the flank. Terran watched from above. Tiny figures ran from the tree line toward the tents. Other tiny figures scrambled about inside the camp. Shouts came from below, faint, distant, as if someone were shouting through a wall. Terran saw Hallmark's soldiers running out of the tents without armor, without formation, without order. They had been caught off guard. At the same time, Ketra threw the rest of his forces onto the bridge. 4,000 infantry and cavalry. 300 soldiers defended the palisade in front of the bridge. They held their ground. But when they saw the camp behind them burning, they ran. Not all of them. Some. enough for the line to collapse. Adra's infantry crossed the bridge. Hallmark's cavalry, which had been hiding behind the hill, attempted a counterattack. Taran saw a movement. The horses emerged from behind the hill and broke into a trot. He threw down the white rag. The enemy is moving. Vars below received the signal. Ketra deployed part of the infantry. Spears into the ground, a wall of pikes. Hallmark's cavalry charged the pikes and rolled back. Taran saw the riders fall, how the horses stumbled, how the line of cavalry broke and scattered. He saw it from above. Tiny figures, tiny dots, tiny death. He didn't hear the cries of the dying. He only saw the dots stop moving. The battle lasted until noon. Then Hallmark fled. He didn't retreat. He fled. Southward, in disarray, abandoning the supply train, the tents, and the wounded. Taran saw the column of fleeing men stretch out along the road and vanish into the dust. He descended, landed, sat down on the grass. His hands were shaking. He had spent 5 hours in the air. He couldn't feel his shoulders. His back was burning. His fingers were rubbed raw by the rope. But that wasn't the reason for the trembling. He had just watched people kill each other. From above, like a god watching ants. He saw everything and felt nothing but a dry, precise understanding of what was happening. The cavalry is coming this way. The infantry is running that way. Those over there are dead. Those over there will soon be dead. Cold clarity. And only when his feet touched the grass did he begin to shake. Vars came over and gave him water. Taran drank, and water ran down his chin because his hands couldn't hold the mug. Vars said they had won. Taran didn't answer. He looked toward the river. Smoke rose above the bridge. Someone had set something on fire. Soldiers or the retreating enemy. He didn't know. He didn't want to know. By evening, Ketra had organized a feast. Not a lavish one. An army feast. Double portions of meat. Wine. Bonfires. The soldiers sang. The officers drank. Ketra sat by the main fire and accepted congratulations from his commanders. Taran was summoned to the general's fire. He came, sat on a log. Ketra raised his mug and said that today's victory was worth half a life, thanks to the man who sees from the sky. The officers turned toward Taran. He felt their gazes. Not hostile, but not friendly either. Appraising. They saw his usefulness. Not him. Ketra said that Adra's losses were fewer than 300. Hallmark's losses were more than 2,000 killed and captured. A ratio of 1 to 7. Unprecedented. Usually in such battles, the losses are roughly equal. Taran listened to the numbers and tried not to think about the fact that 300 dead on his side meant 300 people who had been alive that morning. He took a sip of wine. Bitter. He didn't like wine. He didn't drink at all. But today he drank, because his hands were still shaking, and the wine promised to stop it. That night, a messenger came to his tent. He said General Ketra wanted to see Taran in the morning. There was a new assignment. The army wasn't staying. The army was moving on, south, to pursue Hallmark. And Taran would have to get up every day. Taran lay in the darkness and stared at the canvas ceiling of the tent. He made toys for children. 4 copper coins a day. A quiet life. Now he was worth 300 lives. No, not him. His snake. His eyes. His height. But the line between him and his snake was getting thinner and thinner. To General Ketra, he was the snake. A tool that soars into the sky and returns with information. A useful tool. Valuable. Irreplaceable. But a tool. For 3 weeks, the army had had 40 leagues to south. 3 battles. all one. Terran rose before every one, hanging in the air. I watched. He reported. His body got used to it. His no longer no hurt. My hands became calloused from the rope. Calluses on palms became thick and smooth as the sole of a boot. The pendant he remade twice. The first version pressed on the ribs. The second rubbed my thighs. The third was tolerable. The board wider, the ropes softer. The loops for legs are wrapped fabric. He could sit in the air for hours without significant discomfort. 5 hours with breaks. His eyes had got used to it. He learned to distinguish types. Troops with elevation. Cavalry stands spread out. The horses occupy more space than people. From above, horse camp is a scattering of, with large gaps. Infantry stands in close formation, tents in rows, points close. 2 to each. The is a line, always a line. The carts go one after one. Above, it looks like a seam on fabric. Archers, from the infantry, from the heights. This, a problem. Vars taught him to look, shooting ranges. If nearby the camp, they're a playground with targets. So there, archers. Terran remembered. Right, he could. Upstairs. The paper will blow away. The coal will break, he remembered. Then went down and told to Vars. Vars was drawing. They became a couple, eyes and hands. Terran sees. Vars translates what he sees into the language of war. Ketra relied more and more on their reports. Before every battle, he waited for a sketch from Vars. He wouldn't move without it. The officers at headquarters had stopped looking at Terran as if he were an insect. Now they viewed him as a tool. Valuable, fragile, needing care. Terran was assigned 2 soldiers to assist him. They carried the glider. They assembled and disassembled the frame. They kept an eye on the lines. They reeled them in after a flight. Terran taught them how to check the knots. He explained how to tension the sail. They listened attentively, like students. But no one knew how to fly except Terran. Not because it was physically difficult, because everyone was afraid. Both soldiers refused to sit in the harness when Terran offered. One said outright that he'd rather face the spears than hang in the air on a rope. Terran didn't insist. He understood. He'd been afraid the first 3 times himself. Now he was used to it. But habit isn't something you can pass on to someone else. On the 20th day of the campaign, what Terran had been waiting for and fearing happened. Archers. He was hanging above Hallmark's positions before the 4th battle. The height was normal, the wind was light. The kite held, but not very high, lower than he'd like. He was scanning the left flank of the enemy camp when he saw movement. A group of people at the edge of the forest. They were looking up, at him. Terran felt a chill in his stomach. They could see him. Of course they could. A huge piece of canvas in the sky. It was impossible not to notice. The question wasn't whether they would see him. The question was what they would do when they saw him. He got his answer 10 seconds later. An arrow whizzed past, far away, 10 paces below and to the left. He didn't even hear it whistle. He just saw a dot rise from below, trace an arc, and disappear back toward the ground. The second arrow was closer, 6 paces. The third even closer. They were taking aim. Terran pulled on the rope and began to gain altitude. His hands moved quickly, one tug after another. The 4th arrow flew 2 paces from the suspension line. He heard it whistling through the air, a thin, angry sound. The 5th arrow struck the rope. It didn't break it. It slid along the rope and fell downward. For a moment, Terran felt a tug, a slight one, as if someone had plucked a string. He was rising. The arrows stopped reaching him. He had gone beyond their range. Terran hung at a safe height and looked down. The archers at the edge of the forest were still shooting. The arrows rose. They hovered at their highest point. They fell back down. They didn't reach him. He was safe. But his hands were shaking, and he knew he was lucky. The wind was light, and he was hanging lower than usual. At a normal height, the arrows wouldn't have reached him. But today the wind had let him down, and 5 arrows had whizzed past his body. One grazed the rope. If it had hit the sailcloth, if it had pierced the fabric. A hole in the sailcloth means a loss of lift. The kite could have collapsed. He could have fallen. From a height of 200 paces, in full view of 2 armies. He came down an hour later when the archers had left. Vars was waiting below. His face was white. He had seen the arrows. Terran said something needed to change. Vars agreed. That evening they went to see Ketra. Terran laid out the problem. The arrows, the low wind, the vulnerability of the rope. One lucky arrow and he's dead. Ketra listened in silence. Then he asked what Terran proposed. Terran said 3 things. First, he needs a second rope, a safety rope. If one gets cut, the second one will hold. Second, he needs protection from below. The suspension board needs to be thicker. A wooden shield under the seat. An arrow will pierce a thin board, but won't pierce a thick one. Third, he shouldn't hang over enemy positions. He should hang over his own. The height allows him to see far. He doesn't need to be directly over the enemy. It's enough to be 2 leagues away and watch from a distance. The details are worse. But you only live once. Ketra thought it over. He agreed to the first and second points. He refused the third. He said he needed precise data. From 2 leagues away, Terran won't see a camouflaged ambush. He won't be able to tell infantry from militia. He won't be able to count the wagons in the supply train. Ketra wants precision. So Terran will fly over the enemy. But with 2 ropes and a shield under his butt. Terran looked at the general. Ketra was looking at the map. The conversation was over. Terran stepped out of the tent and stood in the darkness. Vars followed him out. They were silent. Then Vars said there was another problem. Sooner or later, Hallmark would realize they needed to shoot not at the man, but at the rope. For now, they were shooting at Terran. He was a small target against the sky. Hard to hit. But the rope is a line. A long line from the ground to the kite. It's easier to hit along a line. All it takes is one archer who figures that out. Terran nodded. He'd known that from day one. He knew his advantage was temporary. As soon as the enemy learned how to deal with aerial reconnaissance, his life wouldn't be worth a penny. The only question was when. That night, Terran sat by the tent and worked on his design. A second rope, thicker than the main one, tied to a separate point on the frame. If the main rope snapped, the backup would hold the kite and Terran. In theory. He hadn't tested it. He didn't want to test it. He made the shield from a barrel lid. Thick planks. Heavy. The extra weight meant the kite would rise lower, or he'd need a stronger wind. A compromise. Safety versus altitude. Altitude versus accuracy. Accuracy versus life. Every decision takes something away. Nothing comes for free. Rumors reached to the capital Adra faster than the messengers. 3 victories in a row. Losses 1-7. General Ketra doesn't lose. With Ketra has a celestial mage. The last 2 words were from the village to village, and from tavern to tavern, gathering details of which never did existed. Master magician, a man who flies, a person who sees through the clouds, a person to whom the spirits of the sky reveal the location of his enemies. Terran discovered about rumors from the cook. The old man was Soup, and said that he had heard from a merchant who heard from a refugee who heard from a soldier. He said, from the army, Ketri goes who has a contract with the spirits of the wind. He rises into the sky on white wings, and from there sends arrows into the hearts of his enemies. Taran barely choked porridge. White wings? Arrows in the heart? It hangs on board, tied to a rag. His only weapons were his eyes and his ability to keep from throwing up when he got seasick. But people saw what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see was a miracle. Vars found this amusing. He said that rumors about a mage were more useful than the mage himself. The enemy fears what it does not understand. Let them think Taran is a mage. Let them be afraid. Fear is a weapon. Taran didn't find that amusing. He knew how stories about mages ended. The mage is asked to do more. The mage is blamed when something goes wrong. The mage is feared by his own people no less than by strangers. He is not a mage. He is a craftsman. But no one wanted to hear that anymore. On the 30th day of the campaign, the army came to a halt. Hallmark had regrouped. Their new camp stood on the heights south of the river, in a fortified position. More soldiers, more cavalry. They had received reinforcements. Ketra had stopped as well. He needed rest for his troops, and he needed information. Taran rose in the morning. The wind was favorable. The elevation was safe. He surveyed Hallmark's new camp and saw something new. The tents were pitched under the trees, not in the open as before, under the trees. He found no cavalry at all, no supply train either. Everything was hidden. The forest, the ravines, the contours of the terrain. Hallmark had learned his lesson. They realized they were being watched from above and began to hide. Taran descended and told Vars. Vars frowned. This was bad. If the enemy learned to conceal themselves from aerial observation, Taran's advantage would diminish. It wouldn't disappear. The tents under the trees were still visible. Partially. Smoke from the campfires is always visible. The horses don't fit under the tree canopies, but accuracy will drop. Instead of precise counts, there will be rough estimates. Instead of a clear picture, there will be guesswork. They reported to Ketra. The general listened. His expression didn't change. He was used to bad news. He asked what else Taran could see. Taran thought for a moment and said he could see the roads. Even if the camp was hidden, reinforcements would come along the roads. Supply trains traveled along the roads. Messengers rode along the roads. If he watched the roads, he would see movement. Not everything, but enough. Ketra nodded. That would do. The days of observation began. Taran went up twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. He watched the roads. He counted the wagons. He counted the horsemen. He counted the foot soldiers. Every evening, Vars compiled the data. Over the course of 3 days, 12 wagons with cargo and about 400 infantrymen arrived at Hallmark's camp via the southern road. A column of cavalry arrived via the eastern road. About 300 horsemen. Hallmark was building up his forces. Ketra saw the numbers and frowned. His 7,000 against the enemy's growing army. Reinforcements were needed. He sent messengers to the capital. On the 35th day, a man Taran had never seen before came to his tent. Short, thin, dark clothing with no insignia, an ordinary face. The kind of face you forget a minute after turning away. He introduced himself as Diran. He said he had arrived from the capital. He said he had been sent by the royal advisor. He said he wanted to talk about the kites. Taran grew wary. Diran didn't look like an officer. He didn't look like a bureaucrat. He looked like a man who was used to being invisible. Diran asked questions. Lots of questions. How the kite was constructed. What materials. What size. How the rope is attached. How the suspension works. What wind strength is needed. What the maximum altitude is. Taryn answered cautiously. He didn't know the reason for the questions. Diran didn't explain. He just asked and listened and nodded, like a man gathering information for someone else. Diran's last question was strange. He asked if anyone else could fly the kite. Not Taryn, someone else. Taryn said that theoretically, yes. The kite lifts anyone who weighs light enough. The suspension is universal. But steering requires experience, a feel for the wind, altitude control, the ability to read the tension in the string. That has to be learned. Weeks, maybe months. Diran nodded. He thanked him. He left. Taryn watched him go and felt something unpleasant, like a chill between his shoulder blades. He told Vars about the visit. Vars's face darkened. He said that Diran was most likely from the secret chancellery, royal intelligence, not military, political. They gather information on anything that might be useful to the crown. Zmei is definitely useful to the crown. The question is why they need someone else instead of Taryn. Vars looked at Taryn and told him to be careful. Taryn asked with whom. Vars replied, with everyone. That night, Taryn didn't sleep. He lay in his tent and listened to the sounds of the camp. The soldiers snoring, the crackling of the fire, the sentry's footsteps, a horse neighing somewhere, the usual sounds. But behind them, Taryn heard something else. Silence. The kind of silence that settles in when you're being watched. He didn't see the watchers. He didn't hear them. But he knew they were there. Diran didn't come alone. People like Diran always have other people like Diran around them. Taryn rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. He remembered the market square in Brenmore, the counter, 4 little snakes, copper coins, a simple world with simple rules. Made, sold, ate, slept. Now the rules are different. Now he's surrounded by generals who want his eyes, spies who want his secrets, and enemies who want him dead. And the only thing standing between him and all of them is a piece of canvas on a bamboo frame. On 40th day of the Ketri stood in place. Reinforcements from the capital did arrive. The messengers returned with the reply. The King Adra Marin III is considering the request. Reviewing. Ketra crumpled the letter and threw into the fire. He looks at Means, waits. Waits until Ketra gets on his own or loses. If he manages, then reinforcements will needed. If loses, then reinforcements won't help. Politics. The general knew this game. He played it for years. But if that doesn't meet easier, and Hallmark didn't expect it. Every day Taryn got up, and every day saw that the roads to the enemy camp are traffic, wagons, infantry, cavalry. Hallmark gathered everything he could. For 2 weeks their army had in size. Now there are 5,000, closer to 10. Taryn saw the scale, and it was hard to breathe. 10,000 against 7, and the gap is growing. Vars compiled the figures every evening, and every evening the numbers got worse. Ketra studied the data and remained silent. His face turned gray. He out of fear, from exhaustion. He didn't sleep. He was planning. He was calculating. He was looking a way out from the trap from which he had by capital. At 40th 33rd day, Taryn saw something in the air. He was watching toward the road as usual. He was counting the carriages, and noticed a group of riders which turned off the road and drove north-north, not to the Hallmark, toward north, toward the positions Adra. 6 riders, without banners, without supply carts. 6 men who separated from the column Hallmark and Let's go in toward the enemy camp. Taryn did understand why. He took off the white rag. The enemy is moving. Vars below received the signal and got ready. When Taryn went down, told me. 6 riders. They turned off the road. They're north-north. Vars fell into thought. Then his face changed. He said one word. Spies. 6 riders without banners who separate from the army and are heading to the enemies. Not attack. Not reconnaissance in combat. 6 men on horses is mission. Infiltration. Espionage. Or something worse. They reported to Quatre. The general listened and sent AA to intercept the 6. 10 riders rode off to east. Terran rose again to keep watch. With the air, he could both groups. His 10 points jumping to east. Strangers' 6 points moving toward north. The distance between them was shrinking. But strangers were faster. They knew the terrain. Or at least they had better horses. They made it. They into the before that we the Ketra arrived to them. The forest swallowed them. 6 dots disappeared under the trees. Terran lost them. He hovered over the forest and saw nothing. The trees blocked everything. He descended. He reported. Ketra took the news calmly. He reinforced the camp's security. He doubled the night patrols. He posted additional sentries at all approaches. Vars came to Terran in the evening. He was more serious than usual. He sat down next to the tent. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that Hallmark's spies might not have come for military secrets. Terran looked at him. Vars explained. Ketra's military secrets aren't worth 6 horsemen. Troop dispositions change every day. Plans change every hour. By the time a spy gets back, the information will be outdated. But there is one secret that never goes out of date. The serpent. The technology. The man who flies. Hallmark lost 3 battles because of aerial reconnaissance. Their commanders aren't fools. They figured out the reason, and they want to eliminate that reason. Vars looked at Terran. Terran understood. The 6 riders had come for him. Not for the maps, not for the plans, for him personally, either to kidnap him or to kill him. Because the design of the kite can be copied. Canvas and bamboo. Nothing complicated. But skill cannot be copied. The ability to fly. The ability to read the battlefield from above. The ability not to crash in a gust of wind. That was only in his hands and in his head. Taking him meant taking away all of Adra's advantage. Killing him meant nullifying that advantage. Either outcome suited Hallmark. Terran sat by the tent and looked out at the camp. 7,000 soldiers around him. Campfires. Sentries. Walls of living men. And somewhere in the darkness beyond those walls, 6 men who had come specifically for him. He couldn't sleep. He lay with his eyes open. Every sound seemed like a footstep. Every shadow seemed like a man. He had never felt like a target. He was a craftsman, a small man, inconspicuous. Now he was the most conspicuous man in the army. Literally. He was hanging in the sky on a piece of canvas, visible for miles. In the morning, he went to the glider. He checked the frame. He checked the rope. He checked the suspension. Everything was in place. Then he checked again, because the spies might not steal or kill him. They could make it easier. Cut the rope. Loosen the knot on the frame. Snap a bamboo stalk. A small sabotage he wouldn't notice until he took off. And then it would be too late. Terran examined every bamboo stalk in the light. He ran every inch of rope through his fingers. He untied every knot and tied it again. It took 2 hours. He would do this before every flight, every single time. Now it wasn't just caution. It was a matter of survival. Vars suggested posting guards by the snake around the clock. Ketra agreed. 2 soldiers by day, 2 by night. The serpent and its creator were now guarded like an army standard, because they were worth more than a standard. On the 45th day, Terran woke up in the morning and saw that Hallmark's camp was empty. The tents were still standing. The campfires were smoldering. But there were no people. He stared for a minute. 2. Empty. A decoy camp. A ruse. The tents stuffed with straw, the fires lit and left burning. Hallmark's army had left. At night, quietly. Terran threw off both rags, the white one and the red one. There was no signal for this situation. He improvised. He hurried down. He ran to Ketra. The general was already awake. Terran blurted it out. "The camp is empty. The enemy is gone." Ketra wasn't surprised. He asked where. Terran didn't know. He saw the empty camp, but didn't see the army. It could have left at night in any direction. South, east, west, around the flank. Ketra ordered Terran to take off again and search, to find where 10,000 men had gone. Terran took off. The wind that morning was strong, good for altitude, bad for stability. The glider was being tossed about. Terran held the control line and scanned the horizon. To the south, nothing. To the east, nothing. To the west, he saw dust. Far to the west, a cloud of dust over the road. Hallmark's army was heading west, not south, not retreating, heading west, flanking. Terran estimated their direction. If they continued west and then turned north, they would come out behind Ketra's army. A classic flanking maneuver. In 2 days, 10,000 of Hallmark's soldiers would be behind Ketra, between his army and Brenmore, between his army and its supplies, between his army and home. Terran climbed down and ran to the general. He had never run so fast. Ketra listened. His gray eyes hardened. He unfolded the map and traced an arc with his finger. West, then north, then east. The rear, the flanking maneuver, the trap. Without Terran, he would have found out about it when it was too late, when the enemy army would have cut him off from the road home. Ketra looked at Terran and said he had just saved the army, for the second time. Terran didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a man who knew 6 spies were hunting him, and who every morning climbed into the sky on a rope, right above the field where they wanted to kill him. Ketra gave his orders. The army would break camp in an hour, march west, intercept Hallmark before they complete their flanking maneuver. Terran walked beside the cart carrying his snake and thought about the 6 horsemen they'd never found. They're somewhere here, in the forest, on the road, maybe in the camp itself, in disguise, with altered insignia. 6 men among 7,000, a needle in a haystack. But that needle is looking for him. March toward west took 2 days. The army marched quickly. Ketra drove the men. The stops were short. Sleep 4 hours, wake up in the dark. Again, step, step, step through the road. The rains began in the first day of the march and did stop. Terran could fly. The rain and wind made the kite uncontrollable. The wet sail gets heavy. The bamboo frame slips in wet hands. The rope gets wet and loses strength. He tried get up in the morning the day. The snake went up 20 steps, and it was to the side so abruptly that Terran barely almost fly out the suspension. He came down, said to Vars that you is not allowed. Vars told to Ketra. The general accepted it without expression. He was 2 restrictions. Rain is a limitation. Just dark night, like thick fog, like any other thing that gets in the way seeing. But Terran felt guilt. The general led the army blindly, without reconnaissance from the air. Horseback patrols rode ahead and returned with fragmentary data. We saw traces, lots traces. The Hallmark passed through here. Direction west-northwest. Age 1 day. It may less. Ketra checked the map and moved on. On the morning the stopped, Terran got up a little before that as the dried up. The wind was gusty. The snake was being tossed about. Terran held the rope with hands and clenched his teeth. The height is small, below than usual. but enough. He saw Hallmark's army. It was closer than Ketra, not than 2 days' journey, in half the day. 10 people stood camped in a wide valley between two hills. They were waited until Terran saw something else. The second army. Small. 2 or 3,000. It was from the south, toward the main army Hallmark. Reinforcements. 1-1. If these two armies join, then at Hallmark there will be 12 or 13,000, against 7,000 Ketri, almost 2-1. Terran went and ran. Ketra accepted the report. His face did change, but fingers that held the edge of the map had turned white from the pressure. He was thinking. The officers stood around him in silence. No one offered advice. When the general is thinking, you keep quiet. Ketra made his decision. Attack. Now. Before Hallmark's two armies joined forces. Strike the main army while the reinforcements were still halfway there. 7,000 against 10,000. Bad odds, but better than 7 against 13. The army moved out, not at a march, at a run. The infantry ran along the wet road in full gear. It was hard. It was dirty. Men fell. They got back up. They ran on. The cavalry rode ahead. The supply train remained behind. Terran sat on a cart with a snake, and he was shaken by every bump. He watched the soldiers running past and saw their faces. Wet. Red with exertion. Focused. They didn't know why they were running. They only knew that the general had ordered it. 3 hours later, the army reached the valley. Hallmark hadn't expected an attack. Their scouts spotted the Adra too late. Ketra didn't give them time to form ranks. The cavalry struck first, on the left flank. Where Hallmark's camp met the foot of the hill, the infantry attacked head-on, straight from the march, without formation, in a mob. It was not a pretty battle, not a tactical maneuver. It was a brawl. Dirty, wet, desperate. Terran rose up. The wind was gusty. The snake was tossing him about. He was barely hanging on, but he was up high and could see. He saw that Hallmark's right flank was weaker than the left. He saw that their cavalry was still saddling their horses. He saw that the supply train hadn't had time to move back and was hindering their infantry's maneuver. The wagons blocked the passage between the tents. Hallmark's soldiers were tripping over the tent ropes. They were getting tangled up in their own camp. Terran was sending signals. A white rag, a red rag. He came up with another signal on the fly. He tied a rag to a stone and threw it toward the right flank. Vars below understood. The right flank is weak. Strike there. He ran to Ketra. The general threw the reserves to the right flank. 1,000 infantrymen who had been standing in the rear. They struck the weak spot and broke through the line. Hallmark began to retreat. Not flee, retreat, in an orderly fashion. Their commanders were better than last time. They were pulling their troops back behind the hill, building a new line, regrouping. But Terran saw everything, every movement, every regrouping. He saw where the cavalry was retreating, saw where the new defensive line was being built, saw where the weak spots were, and he relayed it down. The battle lasted until evening. 7 hours. Terran spent 5 of them in the air. His hands were torn to the bone. The rope cut into the calluses and pierced them. Blood ran down the rope. He felt no pain. Adrenaline, fear, concentration, all together. By sunset, Hallmark had retreated behind the southern hill. Heavy losses on both sides. Ketra lost about 1,500. Hallmark more, maybe 3,000. But Hallmark has reinforcements halfway there. Ketra has no reinforcements. The general understood this. He did not pursue. He held his position. He posted sentries. He ordered trenches to be dug. Terran descended in the darkness. The landing was rough. He couldn't see the ground. His legs gave out. He fell on his side. He lay in the mud and couldn't get up. His legs wouldn't obey him. His arms wouldn't obey him. His whole body was one big spasm. Vars found him. He lifted him up, carried him to the tent, gave him water. Terran drank, and the water ran down his chin onto his chest because his lips wouldn't obey him. Vars bandaged his hands, strips of clean cloth on his torn palms. Terran watched as Vars bandaged his fingers and thought that tomorrow he would have to hold the rope with these hands again. Vars was thinking the same thing. He said they needed gloves, leather ones, thick ones, like the horsemen wear. Terran nodded. Gloves. Another improvement he should have thought of sooner, before he'd torn the skin off his palms. At night, Terran heard the moans of the wounded coming from the medical tent. 1,500. No, not 1,500 wounded. 1,500 casualties, killed and wounded combined. The dead don't moan. Those who moan are still alive and wish they weren't. Terran lay there listening and couldn't cover his ears because his hands were wrapped in rags and any movement caused pain. In the morning, a messenger arrived. Ketra wants to see you. Terran stood up. Every movement took effort. He walked to the general's tent. Ketra was sitting at a map. He looked worse than yesterday. Grayer, older. He looked at Terran's bandaged hands and said nothing about them. He said that Hallmark's reinforcements had arrived during the night. The sentries had seen lights to the south. The two armies had joined forces. Now there were 12,000 of them, against Ketra's 5,500 after yesterday's losses. Ketra said he was retreating, to the north, toward Brenmore. He couldn't fight 1 against 2. He couldn't hold his position. He can't attack. He can only retreat and wait for reinforcements that might not come. Terran listened and understood that the general wasn't telling him this just for information's sake. He was saying it because Terran was the only person in the army who could see the whole picture, from the ground and from the air. Ketra didn't need his eyes. He needed confirmation that retreating was the right decision. Terran didn't know if it was the right one or not. He was a craftsman. But he said he'd seen reinforcements coming from the south yesterday, and that a head-on battle with 12,000 men was suicide. Ketra nodded, as if he'd received permission. The army began its retreat at noon. The retreat is not flee. Ketra retreated slowly, in an orderly fashion. The rear guard covered their retreat. The sentries kept the pursuers. The convoy marched ahead. The wounded were loaded onto wagons. Terran climbed every morning and every evening. I kept an eye on Hallmark. The enemy followed close behind. He in a hurry. He kept his distance, 1 league. Didn't attack. I waited. Vars said that they are waiting a mistake. When the retreating army grows or loses order, the enemy strike. Ketra did not let the army to get tired. Rest were regular. Sleep is sufficient. Food is hot. He took care of people. He energy. Digression to north lasted 6 days. At that time happened 3 things. The first happened on the second day. Terran was flying over the column and watched Hallmark. Hallmark noticed movement to the west. A small detachment, 30 or 40 riders. It moved in parallel the column Ketra, but on side. Through the forest. If Terran had been in the air, he would not have them. The trees blocked the view of ground. But from above, riders flashed in gaps between the treetops. They walked in parallel. They converged. They drifted apart. They watched. Terran reported. Ketra sent a mounted scout. The riders vanished into the forest. That evening, Vars said it was an advance party. Hallmark is preparing a flanking maneuver. Again. The same trick. But now Terran sees it coming. The second incident happened on the 4th day. At night, someone crept up to the cart where the snake lay. The sentry heard a rustle. He called out. A shadow darted into the darkness. The sentry sounded the alarm. 4 more soldiers ran over. They searched the perimeter. They found no one. In the morning, Taran checked the snake. For a long time. Thoroughly. He found it. One of the ropes had been cut. Not completely. By a third. Imperceptible from the outside. But if pulled hard, the rope would snap. The pendant was hanging on that very cord. If Taran hadn't checked it, he would have been lifted into the air, and at the first strong gust of wind, the cord would have snapped, and he would have plummeted to the ground from a height of 200 paces. Taran stood and looked at the slashed rope, his hands trembling. Not from the cold. Spies. The 6 horsemen who were never caught. They're here, in the camp or near the camp. They found the snake. They know where he sleeps. They know his routine. They almost killed him. Taran replaced the rope. Then he went to Ketra. The general listened. His face darkened. He summoned the guard commander and ordered the guard detail around the snake tripled. 6 men by day, 6 by night, around the clock. Taran sleeps in a tent between 2 sentries. The serpent is kept not on a cart, but in a tent next to headquarters. Only Taran and Vars have access, no one else. The third thing happened on the 6th day, before Brenmer. The army approached the city and saw that the gates were closed. There were people on the walls, not townspeople, soldiers, with Hallmark's banners. Brenmer had been taken. While Ketra was fighting in the south, the enemy had flanked him from the west. Those 40 horsemen Taran had seen in the forest weren't just observers. They were the vanguard. The main forces of the flanking maneuver had passed further west, further than Taran could see, even from the highest vantage point. They had come in from the west and taken Brenmer, a small town, a weak garrison, low walls. There was almost no resistance. Now Ketra stood before his own base, which had become an enemy stronghold. Ahead lay Brenmer, with Hallmark's garrison. Behind him, a 12,000-strong pursuing army was a day's march away. A trap. Ketra gathered his staff on a hill east of the town. Taran stood among the officers and listened. The situation was desperate. There was nowhere to retreat. Hallmark's army was behind them. They couldn't attack Brenmore. The walls were strong. The garrison was fresh. A storming of the city would drain their last reserves of strength. Ketra could head east, away from the road, through the forests. But that meant abandoning the supply train, abandoning the wounded, abandoning the heavy equipment, and then wandering through the forests until Hallmark caught up with his weakened army. The general stood over the map and was silent. The officers were silent. Taran was silent. Then Ketra turned to him. His gray eyes were hard, tired. He asked what Taran would see if he went up there now. Taran didn't know what to say. He sees what he sees. The city, the roads, the fields, forests. He couldn't see a way out of the trap because the trap wasn't in the terrain, but in the numbers. 5,500 against 12,000 in the rear and the garrison in front. But he went to the snake and climbed up. The wind was light. The height was small. He surveyed Brenmore from above. The city he had known all his life. Roofs, streets, the market square, Widow Essa's house, his workshop. Everything was the same. But there were foreign soldiers on the walls, foreign horses in the square, Hallmark's banners above the gates. He looked at the walls. The north wall was the highest. The gates were fortified. The south wall was lower. The western wall runs along the river. The eastern wall. Taran stopped. The eastern wall is the lowest. He knew that. He had lived in this city for 32 years. The eastern wall is low because beyond it lies a marshy lowland, and no one expects an attack from there. Carts won't get through. Horses will get stuck. Foot soldiers will be knee-deep in mud. But Taran looked down at the lowland from above and saw something. A path. Narrow. Dry. It ran along the ridge between two marshy areas. It's not visible from the ground. The grass hides it. But from above, it stood out like a scar on the skin. A strip of solid ground, wide enough for people walking two abreast. Not for carts. Not for horses. For infantry. Taryn climbed down and ran to Ketra. He told her about the path, about the low eastern wall, about the narrow passage through the swamp. Ketra listened. His eyes changed. Something awoke in them. Not hope. Calculation. Cold, precise calculation. The general unfolded the map and made Taryn point out the path. Taryn pointed it out. It wasn't on the map. Of course it wasn't. The maps were drawn from the ground. You can't see the path from the ground. Ketra ran his finger across the map from the path to the eastern wall. Then he turned to the officers and began giving orders. Night attack. Infantry. Across the swamp along the path. To the eastern wall. No noise. No signals. Ladders and ropes. Simultaneous diversion in the north. Cavalry. Noise. Torches. Draw the garrison to the northern gate. While they're looking north, the infantry climbs the eastern wall. A simple plan. The only chance. And it exists only because Taryn saw the path through the swamp from above. A path he had walked dozens of times as a child and had forgotten. Which everyone had forgotten. Which isn't on the map, but which is there on the ground if you look from the sky. Night was moonless. Taryn stood at edge of the swamp and looked into darkness. He didn't fly. At night nothing is. Snakes is useless in the dark. But it walked on the infantry, in front, as a guide. He knew this path. Once long he walked along her as a boy. He picked berries in marsh mounds. I was catching frogs. I knew every turn. My legs remembered the way, even if my head had forgotten. 300 soldiers were behind them, along two in a row. Quiet. No torches, no lanterns, only the sound of footsteps on the grass, and breath. 300 people breathe loudly when they're afraid. Taryn went first. Every step he checked with my foot before shift my. Wait, firmly, you can. Step, firmly. Okay, step. One time his leg went into the he stopped. He found a firm spot. He walked around it. The one who was walking behind him, soldier repeated. And next one. And the next one. The chain wrapped every pothole, exactly following its path. If he makes a mistake, then the first 10 people will get stuck. After them, the rest. 300 men on the narrow path in the middle of the swamp. Silent. Helpless. A target for any archer on the wall. Taryn was right. An hour later, they reached the dry shore at the foot of the eastern wall. The wall was close. Taryn could see the stones in the darkness, gray against black. A low wall, 2.5 times a man's height, maybe 3. It was quiet on the wall. No one there. The Hallmark garrison was looking north. Noise was coming from there. Ketra's cavalry was doing its job. Torches, shouts, the clatter of hooves, a show of force. The garrison had pulled its men up to the northern gate. The eastern wall was empty. Taryn stepped aside. His work was done. He had shown them the path. The soldiers took it from there. They knew what to do. Ladders were set up against the wall. Ropes with hooks flew upward. The first soldier climbed up. Quietly. Quickly. The second followed. The third. The 10th. The 30th. They scrambled over the parapet and vanished into the darkness of the city. Not a sound. Taryn stood below and counted. 50. 100, 150, 200. When 200 soldiers were on the wall, a shout rang out. Someone had spotted them. A sentry, a guard. It didn't matter. The shout shattered the silence. A second followed. A third. Then the clang of metal. A fight on the wall. The remaining 100 soldiers scrambled up faster. It was no longer quiet. Now speed was more important than silence. Terran heard the fighting but couldn't see it. The darkness and the wall hid everything. Sounds. Only sounds. Clanging, shouts, blows. Something heavy fell from the parapet and hit the ground 10 paces from Terran. A body. He couldn't tell whose, his own or someone else's. The battle on the wall lasted about 20 minutes. Then it died down. A voice from above shouted that the wall had been taken. The voice was friendly. Terran exhaled. He hadn't breathed for the entire 20 minutes and hadn't even noticed. The soldiers opened the eastern gate from the inside. The rest of the infantry entered the city. The fighting moved to the streets, house by house, intersection by intersection. The Hallmark garrison was small, maybe 1,000 men, against the 3,000 Ketra had sent to storm the city. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. But street fighting isn't like a battlefield. Here, every house is a fortress, every corner an ambush. The garrison fought, desperately. They knew there would be no mercy. They had captured a foreign city. They would die in it. Terran walked through the streets of Brenmer behind the infantry line. He recognized the houses. The tailor's shop, smashed. The door torn off, dark inside. The blacksmith's house, the roof on fire, orange light on wet stones. The market square, carts overturned, a barricade. Behind it, Hallmark's soldiers. In front of it, the dead. Friends and foes mixed together. Terran skirted the square through an alley. He knew these alleys. He grew up here. He turned the corner and stopped. The widow Essa's house. It stands, intact. The door is closed. The windows are dark. He stood before the door and walked away. Not the time. By dawn, the battle was over. Hallmark's garrison had surrendered. Those who remained alive, about 400 men. The rest were dead or had fled through the north gate in the darkness. Brenmore belonged to Adra once more. But the city had suffered. 10 houses had burned down. The market square was destroyed. The walls were damaged. The well on the south side was filled with corpses. Not on purpose. Bodies had fallen wherever they fell. Terran sat on a log by the eastern gate and looked at the city to which he had returned. Not as a resident, as a soldier. No, not as a soldier. As an instrument of war brought here by the general, who had shown the path through the swamp along which death had come. In the morning, Ketra entered the city. He inspected the walls, assessed the damage, ordered repairs. Then he summoned Terran. The general stood on the northern tower and looked north. There, dust was rising on the road. Hallmark's army, 12,000. They're a day's march away, maybe less. They've learned that Brenmer has been recaptured. They're coming. Ketra said Terran had 24 hours. 24 hours for what? To climb up and see everything. Every road, every path, every fold of the terrain around Brenmer. Ketra would defend the city. 5,500 behind the walls, against 12,000 in the open. The walls evened the odds, but only if Ketra knew where the attack would come from. Terran nodded and followed the snake. His hands were half-healed. New calluses over old ones. The leather gloves sewn for him on Ketra's orders were stiff but held up. He assembled the snake in the courtyard by the eastern gate. He climbed up. The wind was good. The height was good. He looked at the land around Brenmer and saw it as never before. Every ravine, every hill, every grove. He saw where cavalry could be hidden, where siege engines could be brought in, unnoticed. Where the blind spots were, out of range of the arrows from the walls. He saw the city's weaknesses, which he had known all his life, but had never noticed. The southern wall was too close to the ravine. The enemy could approach along the ravine, and the wall wouldn't spot them until the very last moment. The western side is protected by the river, but in the dry season, the river runs shallow and can be forded in 2 places. The northern gate is the strongest, but the road leading to it is straight. A wheeled battering ram could reach the gate unhindered. Terran would go down and report. He climbed up and looked again. He came down and reported. 4 flights in a day. Vars drew a map. Not the map that lies. A new one. The correct one. Drawn from the sky. The first map in the history of this world that shows the land as it truly is. In the evening, Vars laid the map before Ketra. The general looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Terran and said that it was worth more than his entire army. Terran didn't answer. He was too tired to answer. The army hallmark approached to Brenmer on the next day. Terran was out the air when they appeared. At first, mounted patrols. Dozens of horsemen scattered across fields toward the north from the city. Beyond them, the infantry, a long column. Terran considered and lost and started over again. A lot. So many. The line stretched beyond the horizon. This wasn't 12,000. It's more. Even reinforcements. Terran estimated by the length of the Terran and the number of banners. Vars taught him that every banner is roughly 500 people. He counted 30-22 flags. 16,000. At Ketra, Hezend and a half. 3-1. Terran went downstairs. He reported. Ketra accepted the figure silently. 3-1 in field is a rout. 3-1 against defense walls, it's hard, but possible. The walls of question are not fortress. City wall. Stone and mortar. Height 3 or 4 human tall. Towers at the corners. A look with the northern side is shallow, but it's better than nothing. Hallmark didn't attack on the first day. They set up camp north of the city, out of arrow range, out of reach of everything except Terran's eyes. He stood up and surveyed the camp. Tents, siege engines. He saw them, and his heart sank. 2 siege towers, dismantled, on carts. They're assembling them. A battering ram, a large one, on wheels, covered with hides for protection against fire. Ladders. Dozens of ladders. Hallmark had come to take the city, not to besiege it, to take it. The assault would be soon. Terran reported. Ketra listened and began to prepare. The walls were reinforced from the inside with planks and earth. The northern moat was deepened. A barricade of stones and wagon debris was piled up in front of the gates. Every soldier knew his position. Every archer knew his sector. On the second day, Hallmark began the bombardment. Catapults, 3 of them. Terran hadn't seen them before. They stood behind the hill, hidden from the walls, but not from the sky. Terran saw them on the very first launch. Stones flew over the walls. Heavy cobblestones, the size of a human head. They struck the houses, the walls, into the streets. The first stone hit the roof of a house near the market square and broke through it. The second struck a wall and knocked 3 stones out of the masonry. The third fell onto an empty street, bounced like a ball, and crashed into a well house. Terran hung in the air and watched as his city was destroyed. Stone after stone, blow after blow. He saw where they were firing from. 3 catapults behind the hill. He knew the distance and the direction. He climbed down and told Ketra. The general ordered the archers to fire over the hill, across the square, blindly. But not entirely blindly. Terran climbed up again and began making adjustments. He saw where the arrows were landing. He saw the catapults. He saw the distance between the arrows and the targets. He sent down signals. He came up with new ones. A rag tied to a stone and thrown to the right meant to shift the fire to the right. To the left meant to the left. 2 stones meant further. 1 stone meant closer. Vars down below was relaying the instructions to the archers. 20 minutes of adjustments. The arrows began to fall closer to the catapults, then onto the catapults. Terran saw the men at the catapults scramble, saw one fall, saw a second. Run. The shooting stopped. The catapults fell silent. Not for long. An hour later, they were moved, further from the walls, further from the arrows. Stones flew again, but less frequently and with less accuracy. Distance ate away at accuracy. Terran adjusted the archer's aim all day. It was exhausting. Climb up, look, send a signal. Climb down, explain to Vars. Climb up again, check the results, send a new signal. Each cycle took 20 minutes. Every climb drained his strength. By evening, he could barely hold the rope. On the 3rd day, Hallmark launched an assault. The siege towers had been assembled overnight. 2 wooden structures on wheels, taller than the city wall. Dozens of soldiers pushed them forward. At the same time, the battering ram advanced toward the gate. Infantry with ladders ran toward the south wall. Terran was in the air. He saw everything. He saw the directions of the attacks. He saw that the main assault was coming at the north gate with the battering ram. He saw that the towers were heading for the western wall. He saw that the southern attack was a diversion. Few men, few ladders, a show of force. The real assault was in the north and west. He sent the signals. Vars ran to Ketra. The general shifted reserves from the southern wall to the northern and western walls. He left the southern wall almost defenseless. Risky. If Terran was wrong and the southern attack was real, the wall would fall. Terran was not wrong. The southern attack fizzled out on its own. 12 ladders, 100 soldiers. Against even a weakened garrison, that was not enough. In the north, the fighting was fierce. The battering ram pounded the gate, blow after blow. The wood creaked. The gate leaves buckled. Ketra ordered the gate to be blocked from the inside with stones and carts. It held. For now. In the west, the siege towers approached the wall. The first one touched the parapet. The drawbridge lowered. Hallmark's soldiers surged onto the wall. A battle on the parapet. Terran watched from above as tiny figures hacked at each other on a narrow strip of stone 3 paces wide. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.